Welcome, everyone. Again, I am Dr. Nicole Warmington Granston, and we're again looking at politics in Latin America and the Caribbean with a focus on revolutionary change across the region. In this quick overview, we'll talk about, what did revolutions look like in the region, with specific focus on Mexico, Bolivia, and Cuba, and how it actually impacted Latin American politics. Then we look at the idea of neo-social movements in the region and whether or not we found if revolutions have been compatible with democracy across the region. Now, revolutions in Latin America, what was at stake? We know that Latin America has had a long history of revolutionary struggle aimed at deep social and economic transformation, driven primarily by extreme inequality, exclusionary politics, and elite domination. While revolution is often used broadly in the region to describe any power shift, the material emphasizes that many so-called revolutions, especially the independence movements, changed political elites without fundamentally restructuring society. As such, when you look at the core tension of revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbean, is we find that revolutions promise democracy and social justice, but often resulted in new forms of authoritarianism. Why did they occur? Revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbean emerged when political systems excluded large portions of the population, when economic policies perpetuated poverty or ethnic marginalization. You found that it occurred when elites resisted any type of reform and when the state loses legitimacy. So we find that despite repeated failures or partial outcomes, the vision of total transformation continues to inspire revolutionary movements across the region. Now let's look at the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917. The Mexican Revolution was actually a mass bottom-up revolution that was driven by rural peasants demanding pan y tierra, which is bread and land. It was led by figures such as Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, and it culminated in the 1917 Constitution, which at the time was considered one of the most progressive constitutions. The key outcomes from this revolution, the Mexican Revolution, was land reform, labor protections, secular education, reduced power of the church and foreign investors, and the recognition of popular culture and identity. The aftermath of the Mexican Revolution really saw that rather than having sustained democracy, Mexico developed a hegemonic one-party system under the PRI, which we know is called in English the Institutional Revolutionary Party, where they ruled for 71 years through corporatism, clientelism, and electoral manipulation. You saw that political stability came at the cost of genuine democracy, which only began to emerge in the late 20th century, with the full democracy coming to fore in 2020, when there was the first free and fair election in a very, very long time. The key lesson from this revolution was that revolution produces stability and reform, but not necessarily democracy. Next, when we talk about the Bolivian Revolution of 1952, it was rooted in the loss of the Chaco War, foreign economic domination, and indigenous exclusion. The Nationalist Revolutionary Movement, or the MNR, led a multi-class nationalist revolution. The major reforms were universal suffrage, land reform, the nationalization of mines, expansion of education, and the incorporation of indigenous people in national life, which was a major issue. because again of the exclusion we find generally of many indigenous people across Latin American countries. So this was a major thing, including them in national life. Now, the aftermath of this Bolivian revolution was that we found that despite early inclusiveness, the revolution was institutionalized through corporatism, and internal divisions actually led to a military counter-revolution in 1964. So the key lessons we get from the Bolivian Revolution is that Bolivia stands out for expanding citizenship, especially for indigenous populations, but it failed to sustain revolutionary gains. Now, finally, looking at the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Now, the Cuban Revolution actually marked a turning point in Latin American revolutionary politics. Led by Fidel Castro and the July 26th movement, it overthrew Batista and rapidly transformed Cuba into the first socialist state in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the immediate outcomes of this revolution led to the state control of the economy, literacy campaigns. If anybody knows, Cuba is near perfect or 100% literacy rate in the country. It led to universal health care, racial desegregation, and mass population. The international impact of this revolution was that it actually inspired Marxist guerrilla movements across Latin America. We saw where even Cuba supported Marxist movements in Africa and even provide either, monetary aid or tactical aid on the ground across Africa. It actually also triggered U.S. counterinsurgency efforts across the region, and it led to the Cuban embargo and Cold War confrontations, most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The aftermath of the Cuban Revolution was that we saw where Cuba became a single-party communist state, maintaining social achievements by eliminating political pluralism. So Cuba is known for having, perfecting and enhancing human development across their country, but it has a human rights issue. Right. So the key lesson that we learned from Cuba is that it was able to achieve profound social change, but at the cost of political freedom. What do these revolutions teach us? When we look across Mexico, Bolivia, and Cuba, we know that revolutions were not synonymous with democracy. Most resulted in a single party or authoritarian regimes, and social inclusion improved in some cases, but political competition narrowed. The comparative insight that we can take away from this is that with Cuba, we saw inequality, you saw equality without pluralism. With Mexico, we saw stability without democracy. And with Bolivia, we saw inclusion without durability. When looking at newer social movements, right, across the region and even across the world, contemporary movements tend to differ from classic revolutions. They're less violent. They're more focused on civil society. They're often single issue, that of promoting indigenous rights, the environment, gender, and anti-neoliberalism. And they sometimes aim to pressure and reform rather than to overthrow the state, as with the case with Chavez and him bringing his own revolution to Venezuela in 1999. You find generally that these new social movements reflect new political realities, such as expanded participation, mass media, and electoral politics, but they may struggle in being able to articulate a coherent, unified vision of social transformation. So, the conclusion, looking at revolution and democracy today. Despite democratization, inequality and disenfranchisement remain deeply entrenched in the region. The region remains vulnerable to renewed revolutionary pressures as poverty increases and elite tolerance for opposition remains limited. The major takeaway I want you to have is that remains a very powerful idea in Latin America, but its historical record suggests a persistent contradiction between radical change and democratic governance. In all, we know that Latin American revolutions have repeatedly sought justice and inclusion, but more often than not, they replaced exclusionary elites with centralized authoritarian rule rather than durable democracy. Thank you.